Welcome to those who made it through to this episode 9. It takes a new direction. Here we will consider what has gone wrong in the understanding of weight standards. It is directly and deliberately connected to what has gone wrong with rationality itself. Let us review where we are with tri-weight and its history. In earlier episodes, I criticised the most recent official Scottish account of 2004 as very seriously flawed. That book has since been remaindered. Added to that, Wikipedia gives a hopelessly garbled and ill-sourced account of tri-weight, and YouTube in general is just completely hopeless. All the men I usefully read and met or corresponded with have now gone. Grierson, Munro, Sperber, Palliser, Lyon. Whithoft was the last of them. He died last year, aged 92. No professional academic I know of, born after 1940, has added anything of value to the study. Historical metrology became a no-go area for youngsters seeking academic jobs at least 3 generations back. 300 years of study has been erased. Try raising a general question about old weight standards with some young person on a professional track. You will be snubbed if you even get a reply. So episode 9 is a kind of murder mystery. Who killed historical metrology? Why did they kill it and how did they kill it? The questions who and why are easy enough. Maynard Keynes killed it in the course of promoting fiat money. Thus, most of this episode will be looking at the troubling details of how this was done. Am I claiming a powerful conspiracy deceived the English-speaking world about the history of weight standards and thus the history of money itself? Yes, I claim exactly that. Maynard Keynes created this conspiracy. Why do I think he favoured such conspiracies? Because he said so. Do you find it strange that one man could successfully set out to hoodwink entire continents? Yes, of course it is surprising, but he did it all the same. Turn on, say, GB News, you will find them explaining over and over and over again that men and women are different. Well, yes. Surely half the population of the Anglosphere are now concerned at the pandemic of stupidity we are experiencing. But for the real causes of this disease, we must look way back in time and start with the propaganda redefining what money is claimed to be. I propose that this whole pandemic of stupidity was created around 1930 at Cambridge University. Not in a laboratory, but a think tank held in a cafe. It became what we see today after being genetically modified at research centres sponsored by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations and their associates. Let me be very specific here. I am not arguing that the switch to fiat money is inherently anti-democratic or even inherently a bad idea. I am just telling you what was actually done, the way it was promoted, the collateral damage. It probably bears no resemblance to what you think happened. Around 1925, seeking a strategy to promote his managed money, Keynes abandoned his study of facts, historical metrology, and began instead to read Freud and plot delusions. Those are just the broad claims. Time now for the details to back them up. I will list all my sources in the About page. Keynes got an undergraduate place at Cambridge University in 1902 and was picked to join the elite secret society known as the Apostles. There he met Bertrand Russell, who was starting to make a name for himself in logic, formalising mathematics. Keynes initially copied Russell, setting himself up as a logician, staking a claim to formalise probability. Keynes' intellectual life, probing the foundations of economics, was a long way in the future. it would not really begin for about another 20 years. In unpublished papers from 1907, we find Keynes already disagreeing with Russell, but about the nature of thought itself. Philosophical problems about probability are closely connected to the problem of induction and thus the nature of scientific truth itself. Keynes' book on probability finally came out in 1921, but Russell never approved it. He thought its account of probability was arbitrary, subjective, and anti-scientific. We can get a sense of how much Keynes disliked science and objectivity from his last public words in 1946 about Newton. He described Newton as tempted by the devil to believe that he could reach all the secrets of God by the pure power of mind. Weird in itself, but even stranger because Keynes was an atheist. It seems Keynes abandoned both Russell and democracy itself on the 7th of March 1915. On that morning, Russell, Keynes and D.H. Lawrence met over breakfast, and they fell out, terminally. In 1938, Keynes spoke candidly about that row and left instructions that the talk should be published, but only after his death. It was in 1949. He said of Russell, Bertie in particular sustained simultaneously a pair of opinions ludicrously incompatible. He held that in fact human affairs were carried on after a most irrational fashion, but that the remedy was quite simple and easy, since all we had to do was carry them on rationally. A discussion of practical affairs on these lines was really very boring, and a discussion of the human heart, which ignored so many of its deeper and blinder passions, both good and bad, was scarcely more interesting. He went on to say, there are insane and irrational springs of wickedness in most men. Civilization is a thin and precarious crust, erected by the personality and the will of a very few, and only maintained by rules and conventions, skilfully put across and guilefully preserved. So, there we have it, the call for conspiracy that I promised. For Keynes, attempting to carry out human affairs rationally was ludicrous. Most people were wicked. Civilization could only be preserved by a very few deceiving the rest. That was written in 1938, but it was inspired in 1915 and implemented from around 1925. After 1915, Keynes and Russell went their separate ways. Russell went to prison opposing the war. Keynes got a government job financing it. Keynes would pick up a lot of experience concerning the financial world as a government advisor while also speculating on the stock market. But it was only in the 1920s that he began to create a new philosophy of money. Around 1920, Keynes started to think historically about what money actually was. Clearly that was very closely related to the weight of coining metal, and had been for several millennia. Keynes knew this and focused his attention very exactly upon historical metrology. Keynes studied the history of weight standards obsessively. He missed meetings, staying up all night bending numbers to fit his theories. But in 1925 he did a U-turn and dumped historical metrology. He called it all Babylonian nonsense. The gold standard became a barbarous relic. His strategy changed, and with it he developed a completely different obsession. Now it was Freudian case histories. I suggest that moment was pivotal, not just for Keynes' career, nor to the understanding of historical metrology. It was the axis upon which society as a whole took a wrong turn. Keynes stopped studying history and started rewriting it. he decided doing politics rationally was ludicrous. In 1930, Keynes published his Treatise on Money. It runs to 800 pages. His first act, on page 2, was to drop a bomb on the idea of weight standards. He wrote, "A contract to pay 10 years hence a weight of gold equal to the weight of the King of England is not the same thing as a contract to pay a weight of gold equal to the weight of an individual who is now King George. It is for the state to declare, when the time comes, who the king is." A monstrosity of a statement. It bears no resemblance to anything that has ever happened. Let us dissect this fairy story. It is constructed around Frege's paradox of reference. As Keynes well knew, in 1905 Russell famously solved Frege's paradox in the paper on denoting. The argument involved a long discussion of a fragment of nonsense, the present King of France. Obviously, Keynes used that paradox to concoct his own story, which deliberately trips up over its own pseudo-reference to a supposed future King of England. Smuggled into the account is a second piece of nonsense, that payment weight might be defined by the body weight of a king. That never happened. My guess would be that Keynes got the idea reading ignorant scoffing at kingly ritual in Persian letters by Montesquieu. Mughal rulers in India did weigh themselves against bags of money, but that was to make charitable donations. The modern British Maundy ceremony involves the king giving to charity a few ounces of silver each year according to his age. In a parallel ceremony, Mughal emperors reportedly gave many kilos of coin to charity twice a year. Whether we look at kingly well-being or charitable giving, the Mughal practice seems morally superior. Thirdly, although the House of Commons might declare who the monarch was, that selection just as likely lay in the hands of Lord Beaverbrook. Historically, the matter had been decided on the battlefields of Towton and Marston Moor. Russell once said, "You take your life in your hands," arguing with Keynes. Most read that as a tribute to the man's intelligence. I rather think it concerns Keynes' genius for packing a great deal of mind-bending nonsense into a neat, bite-sized package. That purpose was, as he told us, to guilefully mislead. That all Western weight standards have a common root in very ancient Babylon was strongly corroborated in the 8 prior videos here. When Keynes rejected historical metrology as Babylonian nonsense, Keynes knew the truth but suppressed it. Thus Keynes was hatching a plan to rewrite both the monetary system and rational democratic politics itself in 1926, when he turned from monetary history to Freud, and his dismissal of historical metrology was a foundation stone for it all. To see how successful Keynes was in this propagandizing, notice that when Keynes' collected works were published in 1971, taking 28 very large volumes, his editors did not find room for most of Keynes' own writing on the topic. On page 18 of the Treatise on Money, Keynes criticised the traditional standard of money fixed by a precise number of troy ounces of gold. We turn 600 pages before we find his own explanation of how a standard of money is to be maintained under his managed money system. It is by central bankers making up their minds. Just how good money managers have been in preserving an objective standard of money by making up their minds is shown by the fact that the UK pound has lost 99% of its value since Keynes wrote that sentence. My main purpose, however, is to expose Keynes' reckless disregard for rationality, how he demolished reality in order to build monetary reform upon the rubble. It is the act of destruction that interests here, rather than the monetary reforms themselves. The stroke of genius in Keynes' plan was to recruit a second disgruntled former Russell pupil to his economics think tank, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Keynes tried to recruit him from 1925. He succeeded in 1929, when Wittgenstein joined the think tank. Here is Wittgenstein. Look at that 1,000-yard stare, perfected over the decades, beautifully capturing the man's diamond-hard opinion of his own supreme intellectual worth. A man who scoffed at any appointed to teach him. What adolescent wannabe philosopher is not a sucker for such an idol? Keynes' genius lay in his audacity, the idea that he could get away with foisting such a creature on the academic world. Back around 1912, it seems only about 6 people were turning up at Russell's lectures. He was still building a career and would be flattered when one of the richest young men on the planet joined his class. He was briefly much engrossed by Wittgenstein's progress, seeing him as a perfect example of genius. 2,000 people parrot that line on the web. In 1922, however, Russell called Wittgenstein now quite stupid, a line almost no one repeats. In 1946, Karl Popper debated Wittgenstein and discussed the debate with Russell. He implied Wittgenstein was a charlatan. That was surely also Russell's view. When Wittgenstein died in 1951, Russell's obituary said nothing about him after 1919. Crucial to this account are the writings on measurement by Wittgenstein as a product of his time at Keynes's economics think tank from 1930 onwards. Here is a piece about some imaginary people who buy and sell wood. The wood is sold according to the area of the top of the pile. Thus it does not matter how tall the pile is, the price is the same. Wittgenstein's point is that such people would not be doing it wrongly, they would do it differently from us. He attempts to justify them morally, saying, what is wrong with giving wood away? He also invents an imaginary tribe who measure things with elastic or soft rubber rulers. Wittgenstein's storyline is the same. They are not wrong, just different. It appears from Rushree's account that the source of this idea is a joke in a 1936 film called Strike Me Pink, in which a dishonest cloth salesman cheats his customers. Wittgenstein must have understood that there might be plenty wrong with the doings of that imaginary tribe, but this time he stays stum. I hope it will cross your mind that the measured money regime Keynes promoted is itself an elastic standard, a standard which central bankers stretch by 2% each year, or most times overshooting that. There is, however, a third case, published in Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Here he invents a third tribe, people who think 2 + 2 = 5. You've guessed it, again they are not wrong, just different. Nobody seems to have noticed that this is exactly the idea Orwell used in his 1984. The central scene in the Orwell 1949 novel is set in room 101, where O'Brien sets out to bully the hero, Winston Smith, into believing that 2 + 2 = 5, using electric shocks. For Orwell, 2 + 2 = 5 symbolises complete mental serfdom, the erasure of independent thought in the face of state tyranny, a boot stamping on the human face. For Wittgenstein, it was not wrong, just different. There is a big contradiction here. Wittgenstein was perhaps the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. Orwell's book still topped the bestseller list 70 years after it was published. Can you find anyone who mentioned this disparity? I cannot. Something is seriously wrong with academic philosophy. 2 plus 2 equals 5 was central to Stalin's propaganda in 1931. Did either of them know this? Did both of them know it? The attack on rationality by Wittgenstein took root and evolved over subsequent generations. Anything goes became a trendy philosophical slogan. We find its progeny everywhere. Today, the politics of inclusion dictate that no idea is ever stupid. It is always just different. Whilst I was writing this talk, Lionel Shriver published a satirical novel entitled "What if calling someone stupid was illegal?" The idea seems to me hardly even satirical. It would be impossible to get a university job these days if you said, quoting Russell, that Wittgenstein was completely stupid, or that he promoted stupidity for anti-democratic reasons. In particular, it has become impossible to discuss historical metrology intelligently. Inevitably, when you start, someone will say something stupid, not out of stupidity directly, but rather out of a vanity immersed in dogma which tramples over careful thought. If you point up the nonsense, others will pile in, defending the offender's right to voice his opinion regardless. Post-Wittgenstein, individuals have been privileged, each and all, to become their own independent form of life, privileged to pick and mix their own so-called truths, and to do so regardless of any malign purpose they might unwittingly foster. That concludes part 1 of this video, which looked in detail at the links between metrology and money and the absurdist arguments brought forward by Keynes and Wittgenstein, aimed at breaking those links for anti-rational and anti-democratic purposes. In the second part, we will consider the broader context in which these ideas won out. The poet T.S. Eliot was a close friend of Keynes and also another hostile ex-pupil of Russell. Like Wittgenstein, Eliot became very religious. In his biography, Skidelsky mentions a conversation with Eliot in which Keynes cynically endorsed religion out of political expediency. Skidelsky, Eliot and Keynes all treat Christianity as if it is a single doctrine, but that in itself is a deception. Back in episode 5, we saw this slide illustrating the hyperinflation of the Roman-managed copper currency in the 4th century AD. I based it upon the summary in the Hall book of 1996, which in turn leans on research into Egyptian papyri published by Bagnall & Co. from 1977 onwards. That is to say, nobody knew about this monetary matter until the late 20th century, and indeed very few have noticed it even now. I twinned that monetary matter, somewhat following from Gibbon, with an ideological matter, that Constantine did not really adopt the religion of the Gospels at all. Recall that this was a man who ordered that slaves romantically linked to free women should be burned alive. It seems to me that Constantine took the name of what once had been the religion of the Gospels, but transformed it into an authoritarian tool undermining rationality. Thus, when Keynes began to create an ideology backing managed or elastic money, he did not know how closely he was following 4th century Roman monetary policy. However, the ideology of late Roman religion was promoted very prominently indeed. This ambiguity in the meaning of the word Christian was clearly brought out in the works of another Wittgenstein fan, Robin Collingwood. Around the year 400, the Briton, Pelagius, criticised the teaching of St. Augustine of Hippo. Pelagius found Augustine's ideas connected to predestination and original sin unbearable. Hard to figure out exactly why, since we only got Augustine's side of the story. It seems to me, logically, Augustine took a stance rather like David Graeber's recent notion of original debt. In 1936, the Oxford History of England purported to give an account of England under the Romans. In it, Collingwood focused upon that spat. Under the guise of offering a historical account, he used bombast to instruct readers that the power to do great things flows not from the human will, but is predetermined by God. He claimed that Augustine, the fiery man of action, understood this, but that Pelagius, a weak dreamer who championed human freedom, was a fool. Recall what Keynes learned from reading Freud. Elite power was not a matter of rationality, it was a matter of personality and will. Clearly Collingwood, like Augustine and Wittgenstein, had personality and will by the lorry load. Did Oxford University Press really think that such blatant sermonising can be called history? You and I have a bone to pick if you do. To get a better idea of what Collingwood was up to, we should look at his New Leviathan, published in 1942. In that work he divides the population in two. Some adults he calls the grown-ups, the rest he calls children. Then he explains that grown-ups have a duty to lie to the rest. On screen I highlight an associated passage advising a ruler concerning lying. He must construct lies that not 1 in 50,000 will see through. This leaves us asking, where did Collingwood's own lying stop? Was what he wrote about Pelagius just a lie? His 1942 picture of society, as rooted in bullying and lying, is not unrealistic, but it resembles nothing I ever read in the Gospels. The view put by Collingwood in New Leviathan is just the same as that held by Keynes. Ordinary people are stupid and wicked, and politics should be arranged behind the scenes by a narrow elite who use psychology to deceive the rest. Let's turn to a very different account of Pelagius from the 1973 book The Age of Arthur by John Morris. Interestingly, Morris, like Orwell, was a friend of Bertrand Russell, not his enemy. Specifically, Morris highlights on page 341 a comment made by an associate of Pelagius called the Sicilian Briton. It runs, "Mankind is divided into 3 classes, the rich, the poor, and those who have enough. Abolish the rich and you will have no poor, for it is the few rich who are the cause of the many poor." Morris argued that Pelagius followed the Christian morality of the Gospels, while Augustine defended its perversion in the service of a wealthy elite. In 1973, it would be easy to dismiss the Sicilian Briton as peddling proto-socialist propaganda. Back then, nobody knew the extent of the 4th century money-printing scandal. Today the facts demand a reappraisal, but none has come. That is how a casual conversation between Keynes and Eliot opens the door to ancient elite propaganda. It leads us to another circle Eliot moved in. He was a member of a small think tank called The Moot, focusing upon religion and social order. Also at The Moot, we find the Manchester chemistry professor Michael Polanyi. Keynes published his general theory promoting elastic money in 1936. Just 2 years later, Polanyi put out a film endorsing and extending those ideas. The film was paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation. Notice that in 1896, J.D. Rockefeller had spent a fortune promoting the gold standard. but by 1938 the foundation had turned that upside down. It was backing elastic money to the hilt. In 1945, still claiming to be a champion of free society, Polanyi changed horses again, this time to philosophy. Wearing that hat, he met with Edward Shills. Shills had been seconded from Chicago to London in 1942 to work in American secret intelligence, the wartime precursor of the CIA. In 1958, Polanyi's post-critical book, Personal Knowledge, appeared. On page 280, we are instructed that, in what Polanyi called a free society, we should return to the notion of faith as dictated by St. Augustine. The work was paid for by the CIA. The simple story suggested here is that elastic money, defended by the anti-rational ideology of original sin and predestination, brought the downfall of most of the Roman Empire. In the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller Foundation and the CIA combined to take us down exactly the same ideological road. There is a forest of scholarly papers explaining how reality is more complicated than this. That is the problem. The wood is hiding in the trees. Shills and Polanyi were part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a sort of cultural arm of NATO. It began as a broad church in 1950, with Bertrand Russell himself as a figurehead. But Russell quit in anger in 1956. By 1967, this CIA-backed organisation was so thoroughly discredited that the CIA itself torpedoed it by revealing its own funding. In what seems to be a limited hangout, men like Michael Polanyi were dumped and exposed to public ridicule. That is as far as the story goes in the public domain, but it is not the end of the story. Judging by the crude measure of Google search results, Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigms is the most popular philosophical idea of our time. In 2018, Errol Morris attacked Kuhn in The Man Who Denied Reality. In his analysis, Morris made Kuhn's idea a direct descendant of what he called the foul rag and bone shop of Wittgenstein exegesis. Nice to find one other old man still standing up for objectivity. Back when Kuhn was a little-known college lecturer, Edward Shills had read a draft of his The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he wrote an ecstatic letter about its possibilities. Morris clearly does not know about that. Anyone who knows the subject of his film Wormwood should find that just plain odd. I wonder if I will ever get a YouTube viewer who will get what I am saying here. Do flag it up in the comments if you dare. In 1944, Keynes wrote concerning the promotion of elastic money, "Dangerous acts can be done safely in a community which thinks and feels rightly, which would be the way to hell if they were executed by those who think and feel wrongly." I rather think it is time to ask, who should start doing the thinking and who should start doing the feeling, and which way is hell anyway? Do let me know what you think.